Greetings, friends! Juan Ingruska here, and this is the weekly Russian Ukrainian War update for the week of October 28th through November 3rd of 2024. And this week, we have a lot of updates, at least on the two particular fronts of the South Donetsk and the Pokrovsk fronts. So let's talk about those, but we also have some updates on other fronts as well. So we are now entering November, and we are now going to be talking about what I call, well, what a lot of people have been calling the Kurakhove cauldron, and we can see this happening in this. You can see it on your screen right now. So what do I mean by that? So here's the city of Kurakhove, which is where now the main clashes are happening. Now, not in the city itself, except, well, the Russians have finally entered the city proper this week, but on the eastern outskirts. But where the battles are actually fiercely taking place are in the villages and towns around the Kurakhove area. And Kurakhove is the main logistics hub for the entire South Donetsk region for Ukraine. And now, the Russians aren't going to storm this directly. What the Russians are doing, and we can see this with their actions, is that they're trying to create a Kurakhove cauldron. We are seeing this with a breakthrough from the south here, from Ugledar towards the village of Constantinople, this village right here. Now, there's a Vochka River, which splits this area in two. And so on the south, they're trying to reach the southern part of the Vochka River. And from the north, they are trying to reach the northern part of the Vochka River. As you can see, they're pushing down here, and they're trying to basically link up and reach the village of Andriivka here. And then they link up, and then if we kind of look at this from a global view, for the Kurakhove cauldron, it looks like something like this. So this entire area that is not under Ukrainian control, as you can see, Kurakhove is the main centerpiece of it, will be encircled, and all the Ukrainians in this area will have to give up their positions. So this is going to be one of the biggest cauldrons since the Mariupol cauldron in 2022. And so, right now the Russians' main goal and what they're doing in the South Donetsk area and in the Pokrovsk direction is now focusing using both those two groupings to create this cauldron, and kind of then, because then if you look at it from a more global scope right here, then that actually kind of flattens the front line a little bit. So you could see that, that they've created a cauldron here, and they're going to be able to basically have this be a more flatter front line, and then they can continue pushing more westward. But, so right now the focus has been in the Kurakhove cauldron, and let's talk about the gains that the Russians have made in the South Donetsk area and then in the Pokrovsk direction, which kind of have been a focus on making this encirclement happen. Let's talk about it here. We talked about how last week the Russians made a breakthrough from this Ugledar. After they captured Ugledar, they made a breakthrough and managed to reach the next Ukrainian defense lines of Charkovsky, Novoukrayinka, and Bogdanovka. And last week they entered those villages, but they were still clearing them. For Bogdanovka and Charkovsky were still held over. Novoukrayinka was only on the outskirts. However, this week the Russians have finally taken all three of these villages. We have confirmations and video confirmations and reports from the Ministry of Defense. So we saw the Russians raising their defense in Charkovsky, in Novoukrayinka, in Bogdanovka. And so while they reached it last week, they have finally fully secured them. And what happened was that they did an attack towards Bogdanovka, which was fully captured, and Charkovsky. And because they took the two on the sides, they were able to basically liquidate the forces that were Novoukrayinka, which were also being assaulted. But since they were getting attacked on three sides, Novoukrayinka fell very fast, and they had to withdraw. So that's how Novoukrayinka fell. And the fields that, so the Russians were moving along these fields here, but the fields that were here around Novoukrayinka were still under Ukrainian control, but they had to give them up because they were at risk of being encircled. So these three villages, which would form the next defense line after Ugledar, have fallen. But that is not the only thing that happened. The Russians have continued pushing northwards. They're pushing towards the village of Rozolova and Constantinople here. And in this way, the Russians have captured the village of Yasnopolonovka and Maximilianovka here. So these two villages have also been taken. And this gives them now a springboard, just open fields, and a lot less, there's still some, obviously this is not just open fields. There's like some trenches and tree lines that the Ukrainians are holding, but they are not as defended as Ugledar is. They're actually on the low ground, and they're not as defended as these three villages were. So while it's not as easy as it sounds, it's a lot easier than Ugledar or trying to break through these three villages here. So The Russians are now trying to reach Rozova. Now, they have this, fancy little road here, which they'll use to reach this village, because once this village is taken, then it's just a direct attack towards Constantinople, which is the main goal. But I feel like the Russians are going to try to bloom here. We're going to talk about what I call the Sharkovsky Novoukrayinka flower here. So the Russians have made a breakthrough here, but if they try to reach Rozolo, they have to push through a lot of fields. And if you look at where they might push through, there's a big salient that happens here. And so what the Russians, I think, are going to do is, yes, they're going to push towards Rozova, but they also will try to push towards the village of Suka Yalka. There's this other river that kind of splits this area right here. So my opinion is that from Maximanovka, they're going to try to push towards Suchka Yala and have their flank be protected by the river here. And then, so they'll have this position here as they push. And then, obviously, they'll also be pushing towards Rozova. But they're also going to push from Salkovsky towards the west here and try to reach the villas of Rozodonovka here. Not only will this cut one of the main supply routes towards Velika Novosolovka, but it will also secure their western flank. So if we look at the global scope on what they plan on doing, it'll be something like this. And at this point, this gives them a more bigger edge, a bigger position to defend themselves. So if we look at the big picture here of where they're planning on pushing and what's going to happen, it's going to be something like this. And so as you can see, this actually creates a better, it's not just a very straight direct line, which can be attacked and cut off very easily. They have a bit of a more bigger space to do so. So this is where the Russians will be pushing in the future. And then from there, then they'll obviously be able to then reach Constantinople and finally cut off the southern line of the retreat from Kurakhove. So that is what's going to happen in the southern direction here. And my guess is that this will also help, encircle Velika Novosolovka in the future, which will probably happen because once they clear out the southern Kurakhove pocket, the Russians will continue pushing westwards, and then this will put the supply routes to Velika Novosolovka under threat. We already see that the Russians are pushing on the western side of Velika Novosolovka to surround it on the western side. So there's a lot of areas that might, which will collapse Velika Novosolovka, which when Kurakhove falls will be like the last, big town in the South Donbass. But Kurakhove is the main logistics hub, which is what the Russians are focusing on. So the big breakthrough is still ongoing. This is a lot of land is being taken, and we shall see how the Russians deal with pushing through these fields and reaching Rozova, Rozdonovka, and Suchka Yar, because this is now the next goals. And once they reach it, they could at least put these places under FPV drone and artillery control. But I think they're going to push towards Constantinople to put the squeeze on it. Or they might not. I think a lot of what Russians like to do is they don't physically cut the last line. They might, the Russians might reach, for example, this area in the north, and this area in the south here, as I mentioned, but then they leave kind of this, so the northern part is cut, but then there's only one escape route left, and they'll be droning this area as the Ukrainians try to fall back towards better positions here, and then this entire area gets cleaned up. So we shall see what happens. There's been some other changes in the South Donetsk area. The Russians have completely captured the village of Katerinivka here, which makes sense. Once the Russians enter this, it was very hard for the Ukrainians to supply it, so they retreated towards the village of Yasotinivka here. And speaking of that, the Russians are now right on the outskirts of it. They have not entered it yet, but they are pushing along these fields to reach the outskirts of the farms of this village. So the Russians might start battling for this village soon. After the fall of Katerinivka, the Russians have entered the village of Antonovka. We have some geolocated footage of the Russians being on the outskirts of this village. This is just to shorten the front line, continue pushing northwards. My guess is the Russians will attack from the south here, and Antonovka will fall to the Russians very soon, within a week or two. So the Russians have entered this village finally, and the Ukrainians probably won't hold on to this village because they'll be attacked from multiple directions, and they'll probably fall back to the more better secure positions in Ilinka and Yasotinivka here. So that is what's happening, and there's some small pushes here, but to be honest, this push in the south here, they don't really need a push here, because the only thing they need to do here is to keep the Ukrainians pinned here, so that when the Russians continue pushing here, it's going to be a lot harder for, a lot easier for the Russians to push towards Constantinople and pin the Ukrainians here so they get encircled. So, also, the Russians are pushing from Bogdanovka towards the village of Trudova here. The Ukrainians actually have a third line of defense where where they built it up, because they thought the Russians would attack directly towards Kurakhove, and so they have a bunch of defenses along this river that are centered in the village of Uspenska here. If you look at map footages, it actually shows um, a lot of trenches around this village of Uspenska, because they were expecting the Russians to continue pushing northwards towards Kurakhove itself. So they have a lot of defenses in the south of Kurakhove, and they have a lot of defenses in Uspenska. But they weren't expecting the Russians to push towards Rozolova and Constantinople here. So, so while the Russians are trying to, rush towards Uspenska, I don't think this will make a lot of progress. I think the best way for the Russians to make any progress is to reach towards Constantinople, which is what a lot of people are saying is going to happen. But yeah, the Russians are making small gains along this reservoir towards Trudova, which is the last village towards Uspenska. So, just wanted to report on some progress on that front. We also talked, there's been no changes in the Kherson fronts and in the Zaporozhye direction. The only changes has really been some small gains to the north of Pernutina and Ladono here. It looks like the Russians have secured themselves along this reservoir, and I wouldn't be surprised if in the next week or two they might try to do some sort of dash to try to take the village of Novodarivka and Rovnopil, and try to kind of take these two villages and kind of push the front line northwards. The main goal, of course, is to reach this highway, this road here, and cut one of the main supply lines to Velika Novosulivka as well. But just some small gains here. They've in the Zaporozhye direction, I think they captured like this area here. So just small little gains in this area. In terms of what else for the South Donetsk area, that's basically what happened. A lot of big gains in this area, and we look forward to seeing where the Russians will push towards next. Yeah, in the Pokrovsk direction, and when we talk about the Pokrovsk direction, we talk about we're talking about this this area, but a lot of the main goal, the main Pokrovsk direction is like this area right here, because it goes towards Pokrovsk. But there's been no changes in this direction for the last 2 or 3 weeks or so. I think the only change in this direction is the Russians took a trench, like a fortification in the south of Minigrad right here. So they're trying to improve their positions in the north of Gridivka and Mykolaievka, which are the frontline positions in front of Minigrad. But besides that, there's been no really big changes in this main Pokrovsk direction. Where the Russians have been focusing in this Pokrovsk direction is, again, trying to be the northern pincer in the Kurakhove cauldron. And this is where actually a lot of the gains have happened this week. So the main thing, one of the biggest gains in this push towards the northern part of Kurakhove is the fall of Kurakhivka here, not to be confused with Kurakhove. So yeah, these two big, these are towns that had populations of about 10,000 each, I believe. And so the fall of these towns is a very big deal, because the Ukrainians are using these as big supply hubs and big supply defenses, and the high ground here, the high ground of this mining district, which fell this week, the fall of this mining mine which fell this week as well. These are the high ground here, and now that the Ukrainians are on the low ground trying to defend the north of Kurakhove. And we talked about the fall of Gernik last week, and the only thing that was left was this mining thing right here, but they took most of the town already. But this week we've got final confirmation that the whole town got taken by the Russians, along with this mining construct here. And because of the Russians basically squeezing Kurakhivka on multiple areas from the south and everything, the Ukrainians had to fall back from Kurakhivka, and the Russians were raising their flags all over this area. They also raised their flags in the north of this mining district here. So one of the biggest gains is the fall of Kurakhivka. And, a lot of this is that, like Kurakhivka is a town of about 10,000 people. And, a battle like that would have taken months in 2023. But now it takes only a few days. So Kurakhivka has fallen. I was expecting that the Russians, again, the Russians are trying to make a smaller encirclement here, trying to reach the southern part of the Volga River and encircle the Ukrainians here. But it looks like the Ukrainians are basically giving up themselves, and I think that's what the Russians are going to do in Kurakhivka, in Kurakhove. As soon as the Russians reach Sushka Yar, Rozola, and it looks like the last line of retreat is falling back, the Ukrainians are going to make a big retreat in the southern part here. They might try to, fall back to Kurakhivka and Uspenska, and everything to the, to the south of this line will fall back. So all these villages will be given up, and then and the Ukrainians really don't want to give up Kurakhove, but they might have to, and so just as Kurakhivka and Gernik fell, which had populations of 10,000, Kurakhove, which is I think bigger, I think it has like population of like 25,000 or something. It's a bigger prize. It's a big logistics hub. It matters more than these two towns. But the Ukrainians will probably still give it up because they don't want to surround thousands of their soldiers in a big pocket. So, so that's probably what's going to happen. The Russians are going to leave one route out, and they're going to fall back, and Kurakhove will probably fall as quickly as Gernik and Kurakhivka, most likely. Along with this, the village of Vojkina here, which is a village to the south of this mine, has also been taken, which makes sense. The Russians already captured the southern part of this from the Volga River here, and once the Russians captured this mine, it was just a matter of time, and the Ukrainians fell back towards Ilyinka and Berestivka here. These are two villages which are the last defenses for the northern part of Kurakhove, and so the Ukrainians are trying to make a defense here. But Vojkina fell, and this entire area basically fell to the Russians. And and the Russians are now pushing to the south here. They have captured more of these fields, and so I have no doubt that the Russians will probably try to take Ilyinka and Berestivka in a week or two. So we shall see. The Russians are pouring. They have the high ground advantage. They have, the Russians are putting the squeeze on them, and it's going to be very hard for the Ukrainians to be able to hold on to these two villages. So yeah, that's the in the more northern part, the Russians are also pushing towards trying to reach. So before I talked about how they're going to go around this rail line to try to make the Gernik-Kurakhivka pocket. The Russians are probably expanding beyond that. There's a small river here that goes around here or so, that reaches the Volga River. And so what I think is going to happen is that the Russians are now going to try to reach Zorya, Santoska, and Stara Terny. And so the Russians are going to try. This is going to be one of the intermediate goals. Just as the intermediate goal, the main goal is Andriivka, and the main goal for the south is Constantinople. But there's a intermediate goal of reaching Rozova, Sushka Yar, and Rozonovka, and for the south. And then for the north, those areas are Stolnotskivka, Startin, and Zorya. The Russians are trying to reach this area and basically take the whole northern part of Kurakhove. So yeah, that's basically the whole goal here. There's been some progress here as well. The Russians have taken the village of Kremena Balka here, and they are now battling for the village of Novosolodivka and Vozhdanivka here. I apologize for the pronunciations, but yeah, and we actually have some progress to the north here. The Russians are battling also for Novodronovka here. It seems like most of this village is under Russian control, but it kind of extends here. This extension right here is still being battled for, but the center of the village has fallen to the Russians. Speaking of that, the Russians are also pushing in the fields between this village and Kremena Balka. So these fields right here have been taken by the Russians this week, and and the center of Novosolodivka has also fallen. I have no doubts that the Russians will probably take these two villages fully this week, and probably also take this village. And then at that point, the Russians will continue pushing towards Zorya. They'll keep pushing towards Sontiskva here, and they'll also keep pushing along the rail lines towards Berestivka here. So the Russians are finally expanding outer Sukurnia, which was a big battle for the last almost 3 weeks or so. But now that Sukurnia has fallen, the Russians are now expanding out of here towards the villages I mentioned earlier. So that's what's happening in the Pokrovsk direction. Now we're going to go to the Terets direction, the Chasiv Yar direction, the Severets direction. Now these directions have had small little some things I want to talk about, but there's not been much progress this week in those areas, but they are still there to talk about for it. In the Tourette's direction, the battle for the center Tourette's is still ongoing, but there's been no real changes there. One of the biggest changes, again, we talked about this last week, was the southern micro district, this area right here. And last week we talked about how the Ukrainians did some sort of counterattack and forced the Russians away from this village. However, at the end of this week, we saw the Ukrainians droning the Russians on the eastern part of this town. And so it looks like the Russians still have a bit of a foothold in this area, but the battles are going very strong for this micro district. Again, the main battles for Tourette's are trying to encircle this big mining complex, which is one of the last biggest defenses for Ukrainians. The Russians have also, according to the Ministry of Defense, fully captured the village of Lodonivka here, which makes sense because they are now battling towards the center of Shyrbrinka here. And again, the main purpose of taking these two villages is to try to encircle the mine from the west here. But they still need to battle for these two villages. So, in order to do that, they had to fully capture the village of Lodonivka here, which they did this week as well. So again, the main focus here has been trying to encircle this mine, but again, there's been some small progress, and the Ukrainians are putting up a big fight there. In the Chasiv Yar direction, the main focus has been in the south here. There's been no really big changes from the game. They made a big gain. They're starting to put the push here. It looks like the Russians are going to try to take Chasiv Yar by the end of the winter campaign because they are starting to drop leaflets to surrender. They are, they made the push out from the Sovietsky Donetsk Donbass Canal. But this week, there's only been small progress this week. The main focus has been on the southern mine here. They took this southern part right here. And it looks like the main clashes are right now trying to take this quarry right here so that they can have a bit of a high ground advantage to try to secure themselves in the southern part of Chasiv Yar. So, and the leaflets were dropped over this forest belt right here. So this is, the Ukrainians have a lot of positions here because they want to defend Chasiv Yar. But the Russians are trying to basically encircle it. So it looks like the Chasiv Yar is gonna start heating up. I mean, it already started heating up like a week or two ago, but they're gonna start trying to encircle this. So they did some small gains trying to improve themselves in the south, but that's it for this week. In the Seversk direction, the Russians have also made some small gains, but nothing major. The Russians are, right now, the main clashes are going on in Vimka and Ivanodanyivka. The Russians try to take these three towns. However, the thing is that there's a high ground. There's hills to the north of these villages right here. And the Ukrainians have a lot of positions here. So that if the Russians take Ivanodanyivka, which they did like a month or two ago, the Ukrainians could just do a counterattack with high ground advantage and push the Russians out. And so the Russians can't really control Vimka or Ivano-Dyrivka directly, but these villagers are basically in the green zone. And they're not really villages at all. They've been like kind of razed to the ground. But in any case, the Russians are trying to make them have secure positions in front, while the Ukrainians have positions on the hills to the north here, the Russians are trying to have positions to the, to the south there, just have some forward positions so that, when they capture these hills to the north, they could finally secure Ivano-Dyrivka and Vimka. So, yeah, that's the Seversk direction. Alrighty, in the front where there's actually been a lot of changes this week, which actually has, where there's actually is almost as exciting as the South Donetsk direction, is the Liman-Kupiansk front. Let's talk about the Liman front here. This week, the Russians are continuing their push towards the village of Terny, which is where the clashes are taking place. The Russians have taken the northern part of Terny here, and so the clashes for the village has officially started. The Russians are also pushing in the fields towards Yampolovka and have captured these fields to the west, to the east of Yampolovka, and so the Russians are putting the squeeze on Terny. And again, the main focus here is to try to take these three villages of Terny, Yampolovka, and Torskoye, so that they could completely clear the Ukrainian positions on the eastern bank of the Zhirbets River. But so they're making small gains. And now the battle for Terny has started, and we shall see if the Russians are able to clear Terny by next week. And now, the biggest thing is the Kupiansk front. This is where a lot of the big changes have happened. Let's talk about them. First of all, we talked about how the Russians have cut the Oska River in half, and this week we have full confirmation that the Russians have completely captured the village of Kurakhivka here, and now the battles are going on for the village of, because they've captured about half of the village of Klosonivka here, capturing this part of the village here, and now just this part of the village remains. Probably the main problem is trying to take this uh, um, this forest right here. There's probably has some like trenches and all that. So once the Russians could clear this forest, they could fully secure the village of Kurakhivka here. But the battle for this village is still ongoing, and the Russians are now pushing southwards and have reached the village of Zastuzovka here. They have captured the northern part of this town, this area right here. But the southern part of this town and the center of it are still under Ukrainian control. But again, the main purpose is to try to expand their zone of control. They have finally cut the Kupiansk and Liman fronts in half, but they are now trying to improve their positions. Because if you look at it from the global scope here, the Russians could be attacked on two sides here. And so they're trying to. My guess is that they're going to try to push here, try to take these two villages of Glashivskivka and Klosanivka here, and then push southwards as well. And then I don't think they're going to keep pushing towards Kupiansk until later, but I think the main push for this winter is going to try to take the village of Borova, which is one of the main logistics hubs besides Liman. So the Russians are expanding their zone of control along the Oska River to try to improve their salient here. But the Russians are also now trying to liquidate everything between these fields. For example, they're pushing along from Shamatovka and Andriivka and are pushing into the Kharkov Oblast. We talked about how they captured the village of Vishana about a week ago. And this week we saw the Russians raise their flags in the village of Pestrotonivka here, this village right here. And so now the Russians have a very good position to continue pushing northwards. A lot of sources are now saying they've taken the village of Kopany here. And from this point, what the Russians may want to do is probably try to, what they're going to try to do from this area is trying to encircle Borova from the south here. Because once they take Kopany, they could then try to, continue pushing southwards here and try to reach the village of Stepova here. And then, kind of outflank here and take the village of Nadina and Chervobunovka here. And once the front line goes something like this, they could then storm the village of Shevkivka here, and then start attacking towards the south of Borova. And when all this is going on, which will probably take about a month, the Russians will be pushing southwards here, trying to reach the northern part of Borova, and also take these fields to the south here, and then they could storm Borova from the north, from the east, and then from the south here, and finally capture this town. So, that the Russians are making small progress here to reach the southern part of Borova. They've taken the village of Pestrotonivka here, and then in the here, the Russians are now continuously pushing in the fields between Pshana, Berestova, and Shchematovka. So this artillery pocket is slowly being closed, and the Ukrainians are falling back towards Lazova and towards the Oska River defenses here. So in this sense, the Russians are pushing along, have captured more areas to the front of Lazova, and they have captured the fields to the between Stomaktovka, Berestova, and Peshana. So these fields have been taken by the Russians, and I have no doubt that the Russians will probably storm Lazova and take it within the next week or so. So we shall see how that all plays out. So these, the Ukrainians are now retreating from this pocket and are trying to reach Novokuliknivka, Lazova, and Bushutkivka here, trying to fall back. So these fields will probably be vacated very much soon, which is already happening. So the Russians are now that they've broken through and cut these defenses in half, now they could do their gains of encircling the Ukrainians and forcing the Ukrainians to retreat. So the main focus here will be the village of Borova, because once Borova falls, then they could start moving towards and start doing their battles for Liman, or at least not battle for Liman, but at least start improving their positions to start working towards the battle of Liman. And then in the northern part of the Kupiansk direction, the Russians have, at least according to map sources, have completely cleared the forests that were near Sinkovka and Liman Pershi. So this forest right here has been taken. And this makes sense. After the fall of Sinkovka and the Russians managed to break through the northern part of Petropolovka, these people in this forest had to fall back and are probably now in the forests guarding Kupiansk itself. So yeah, so this forest has been taken by the Russians, and if the Russians are still in the northern part of Petropavlovka, my guess is they're going to try to take the rest of it and probably try to link up here, because the Russians are also kind of pushing in this Klishivka, Kloturnivka here, and are trying to basically move along this highway towards the southern part of Petropavlovka. Probably will also reach the northern part of Pashana here. And the main goal here will probably be to try to take Petropavlovka and take these fields here, and then move the front line closer and closer to Kupiansk, which is another big goal for the Russians. But in my opinion, I mean, again, I don't have a magic ball. I don't know if the Russians actually will be storming Kupiansk. In my opinion, I think that's it's a bit hard to do that because most of Kupiansk is on the other side of the Osko River, but we shall see. And then we're going to talk about the Kharkov and Kursk fronts. Again, there's nothing happening in the Kharkov front. Again, the thing with Kharkov is that the battle for Verchansk is still going on. It is bloody, it is fierce, but there's been no changes on the ground. And in the Kursk direction, there's actually been a slowdown in operations. This is where the North Koreans are going to be going, they say. The Russians are still holding on to the gains they made in their second Kursk counteroffensive, which secured the positions along this area here. However, most of the clashes have been going on in this northern bridgehead here. It looks like the Russians are trying to, secure their positions here a little bit, and the Ukrainians are trying to hold their northern areas here because the main thing the Russians want to do is do an encirclement here and capture this northern part, and the Ukrainians don't want to do that. So there's been most of the clash has been going on in this northern part here as well, just trying to improve the positions along these fields here, but nothing big. Yeah, so that's the end of this video. Hope you guys enjoyed this video. Be sure to like this video and subscribe to my channel if you want to continue receiving these weekly Russian Ukrainian War updates. Be sure to comment your thoughts and share this video around. So aim high and wander on.